Welcome, everybody. It's nice to see some familiar faces as well as some new faces. So thank you all for coming tonight. And as we're getting started, I just want to introduce my colleague from IPL who's been an amazing support. Actually, we have two IPL people, but my local IPL person, and that's Renica Weimer. She is the one who handles the technical things during this thing. She handles the advocacy acts that we do at the end of the meeting. So I failed to acknowledge her in previous meetings, and I am remiss, and I just want to say I very much appreciate all that she's doing, and she's fresh back from New York. Or are you still in New York?
Thank you. I'm actually still here. I'll be coming back on Friday.
Okay. At any rate, she was at the march on Sunday, and maybe if we have a minute or two, at the end, we might ask her for some of her experiences. Before we get started with our speaker tonight, who is Madison Mayhew, she's from IPL and she knows a lot about everything that's going on in Washington. So she's the perfect speaker to tell us about the intricacies and the constraints on why we do or we do not have budgets and the particular wrinkles in time that we're experiencing this year. But I just thought I would like to talk a little bit about what's going on in the Jewish religion at this point in time as an inspirational message. We're in a 10-day period where we ask forgiveness from people. And on Monday, we read the book of Jonah. I'm sure you're all familiar with the book of Jonah. It's where supposedly Jonah, who was fleeing from being a prophet, was swallowed by a big fish. Some people say a whale. But anyway, this is a commentary on the Jonah story. In the Jonah story, the social movement that coalesces when Jonah reaches Nineveh has a successful political conclusion. Despite Jonah's lack of enthusiasm for his mission and the brevity of his prophecy, his message hits the target. When the tidings reached the king, he rose from his throne and he put on sackcloth. The leader of Nineveh follows the lead of the people, and he repents. He even goes on to proclaim a fast of repentance that all the people and animals of Nineveh did. So just as in the Nineveh story, tipping points are reached at all the time. And I'm reading that because tipping points are exactly where we have to be in order to get legislation passed. Behavior can spread exponentially like an epidemic. The phenomenon is called social or behavioral contagion. Researchers who study social networks have found that the average American has a network of about 600 people. We influence those who are closest to us and second and third degree contacts as well. Since we are unaware of the extent of our influence on others, we, like the people of Nineveh and the readers of the Jonah story, may think that not much is changing until the tipping point is reached. So we are here to act as the tipping point, to help the tipping point. We know that all is possible for us to pass an appropriations bill that will benefit the climate, but what we lack right now is political will. Although attaining that political will may seem unimaginable, we know that societies do change in seemingly unpredictable ways. Changing hearts to inspire individuals, activating communities, and building a broad social movement for change can produce unstoppable moments. So when we reach that tipping point, as in Nineveh, change will happen overnight. Thank you. So now I want to introduce formally Madison, who is, what is your title? Director of?
I'm the Federal Policy Manager.
Federal Policy Manager. In other words, she's more wonky than the wonks themselves about federal policy. But the good thing about Madison is that she can bring wonkiness down to a level that us non-wonks can understand. So without further ado, I would like Madison to give us some enlightenment about the budget process. And then we will talk about, have a question and answer period, and we will follow it up with an action that IPL is doing. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Phyllis, for that incredibly generous introduction. Let me just set up to my screen. Oh, I'm sincerely apologize. I have recently done some new settings on my computer, and I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to unless I can quickly share the slides with with Rinika. Can I send them to you to be shared? Otherwise, I'm afraid I'll have to quit Zoom and reopen it, which I'm not sure is what we want here.
Could you raise your volume?
It's not, can you not hear me?
That's better. Thank you.
Oh, okay, great. Let me see. Okay, here we go. Sorry about that. All right. Thank you all again for having me. It is such a joy to be with all of you. And I'm going to do my best here. I'm definitely not as much of a policy wonk as some other folks in DC, but I'll do my best here. As Phyllis mentioned, I'm the Federal Policy Manager at Interfaith Power and Light. I have the pleasure of working with our IPL affiliates across the network, doing advocacy. I am based here in DC on native Piscataway land. But as we get started, I wanted to do a little bit of grounding to remind ourselves, why should we care about the federal budget? I know all of you are here because you're driven by your values, and I so deeply appreciated Phyllis's reflection as we got started. I think it ties into this conversation so beautifully. But, you know, as people of faith, we believe budgets are moral documents. How we use our money shows what we prioritize. For us, it's clear that we care about our neighbors, environmental justice, and being good stewards of the land. And how we spend our money as a country can dictate how much progress we make to ensure all of our communities can fulfill their right to clean air, clean water, and have the freedom from the fear of harm from toxic pollution. With adequate resources, we can make sure all of our neighbors are cared for and our shared home is ultimately protected. And to give some context of these photos, this was at a rally outside of the White House several months ago, in light of the MVP fight. And we have some folks from Virginia IPL up at the top, and then at the bottom photo has Virginia IPL, and then North Carolina IPL, and then there's me amongst them. And it was a great time championing Appalachian voices at the White House. So to give a very brief and simplified version of how the appropriations process works, I have this chart here. I know that it's a lot of words and a lot of text that may be hard to read, and I apologize for that. I can definitely send this around if it's helpful. But I think it does provide a helpful visual aid on how the appropriations process is supposed to work. Keyword supposed to. And it starts with the president submitting a budget to Congress early in the year, which it's usually, you know, to get to this point, agencies and administrative officials work together to determine how much funding they need for various programs that ultimately shape what the president proposes. From there, it goes to Congress, where Congress begins writing the appropriations bills. And it starts with the Appropriations Committee. At this point, they receive input from constituents, folks like you, and other members about what priorities they see for the federal budget. Then it goes through a markup process after it's written to get reviews and edits before it ultimately moves forward to the voting process. As any bill goes, or the process for a bill, it goes through committee, then voting, and then ultimately goes to conference to have the negotiation between both the House and the Senate to come to a compromise and come to an agreement about what they want the federal budget to look like. And all of this happens or is supposed to happen before the deadline of September 30th. The fiscal year begins on October 1st. So the goal is to ultimately pass a budget before then so that we can fund the government. Obviously, I'm sure as many of you know at this point, this process doesn't happen this way and hasn't happened this way for quite some time. What we do see happening is when the president submits his budget to Congress, they typically ignore it and have their own priorities for what they want to see in the budget. The timeline here gives some suggested timeframes, but ultimately the times here are what actually happens. The only date that does matter in this timeline is the September 30th deadline, where the budget expires and needs to be where there needs to be a new one. What we also see happening, unfortunately, a lot of the time is that Congress has a hard time getting their act together and ultimately passes what's called a continuing resolution, which continues the current funding levels for however long they need or see fit until they are able to pass a budget. We've seen this quite often over the past several years, and a CR, as it's the short name for it, can range from a couple of hours to a couple of months and can even exist for a full year. It's really determined by Congress what they think or what they want to achieve. And, you know, as advocates and as faithful advocates, you know, find this is unacceptable because we know that with every year there are new needs. You know, with inflation, there are price changes. There are different things that need to be met. And so it's bad governance to not update spending levels when it's time. And something to also note in this process is that with the overall appropriations bill, it's made up of 12 individual appropriations titles, which I highlight here. These are all of them that exist. I tried to bold the ones that are most relevant to climate, but obviously they're all intersectional. And with the appropriations process, each title has to go through that committee, hearing, markup, input process, and then ultimately the goal is to pass what's called an omnibus, which is a combination of all of these bills that would ultimately fund the government for the entire fiscal year. What happens sometimes in the case where there might be a CR that I mentioned earlier, a continuing resolution, where funding levels are extended, sometimes Congress will pass what's called a minibus, which is a combination of a couple of these titles where you could see an agriculture, an interior, and a transportation minibus. And then that would ultimately be funded through the fiscal year with the goal of revisiting the other appropriations titles. It gets really wonky and complicated unnecessarily. But because the deadline is quickly approaching, you might hear words thrown out like CR, omnibus, minibus. All of these things are related to this process. And I hope if you have questions about that, I know it's a little complicated. Feel free to ask me at the end. But in light of all of that, where are we with the current fiscal year 24 budget? As I mentioned, the deadline is September 30th, which is very quickly approaching. And as you can see here, I took this screenshot this morning from the Hill that shows that the current process is in utter chaos, which is not where we want to be when it comes to the budget process. Right now, as I mentioned, there are 12 appropriations titles that the House and the Senate both have to separately pass. The House has only successfully passed one, and the Senate has successfully passed all 12, which is hasn't happened in quite some time. But the House bill that they did pass was the House or was the Interior bill, um, which was pretty horrific proposal. It had drastic cuts to the Environmental Protection Agency. It slashed EJ, environmental justice programming. It slashed water protections and cleanup programs and undid a lot of critical victories to the IRA, which is, pretty harmful for a lot of our priorities. And right now, there's some interesting dynamics happening in the House around some of the more conservative members. The Freedom House Caucus has come out and said that they won't support any budget that doesn't have an 8% decrease across all fronts, which is pretty detrimental, as you can imagine, to not only our priorities, but a lot of others. And they have enough numbers to cause quite a stink in the ability to be able to pass a comprehensive budget. As you saw, you might or you might have seen, McCarthy actually began an impeachment process as a way to try to garner support from those the Freedom House Caucus to pass a budget. So it is quite a unusual time on the Hill, in the race against the clock to pass a budget. But it unfortunately, as you can imagine, that means the road at the moment is incredibly unclear. And it's looking likely that there will be a government shutdown. So what is at risk with the budget proposal, and what is going on? So as I mentioned, there are threats to Inflation Reduction Act funding. Some of the more conservative members are really causing a stink about that funding. And as we know, so many of our communities are impacted by the climate crisis right now, and we can't afford to lose these dollars that are so important to helping us transition to a clean energy future. Also, cuts to the EPA and EJ programs. We know that the EPA right now is actually underfunded and understaffed, and so any additional cuts would be really detrimental to the ability to implement new programs or follow up on different things. And we want to make sure that the EPA is fully funded and has the support and staff to be able to do their duty. And obviously, the big giant risk amongst it all is the possibility of a government shutdown, which we know would have detrimental impacts for all of the communities that we're a part of, not just here in DC, but families who rely upon government funding, students, so many folks who would be impacted. And something that I was recently brought to my attention that feels like a pretty obvious thing, but I hadn't thought about it, was recognizing that if there is a government shutdown, it limits the EPA's ability to make progress in the new regulations that have just been finalized around air pollution and other important things that are working towards to address environmental injustice. So we're really mindful of this time and trying to do everything we can to make sure that Congress knows that we can't afford a government shutdown. So some key messaging to think about and ways to take action at the moment. Um, we know that it's important to talk about avoiding a government shutdown, but we also want to emphasize that we don't want to concede to any cuts around funding to programs that we care about. Messaging is important to emphasize both. Focusing on preventing a government shutdown can create a narrative that we're willing to negotiate on program levels, which we are not. And we want to make sure that our Congress knows that we can't afford to reduce any funding around the programs that we care about. And unfortunately, in the budget process, there is something, or there's a process that allows members to propose amendments to budget bills that don't necessarily have to be related to the bill. These are called poison pill writers, which are often, it's a tactic done to tank a bill when someone doesn't agree with the priorities or the goals of the bill. And we've seen some members of Congress use this tactic in a really harmful way and introduce poison pill writers that are incredibly harmful to the environment, to wildlife, to the some EPA regulations. And so something that we're calling for and that's really important to emphasize is passing a clean budget, which just means a budget without any of these poison pill writers. And then just following what the messaging that was mentioned earlier, recognizing that our communities and our sacred earth cannot afford any budget cuts. So many of our neighbors and the land where we live is hurting, and we need to do all we can to support the good work that's being done to address the climate crisis in real time. And obviously protect IRA funding, such historic levels of funding that is meant to help us transition to clean energy and off of fossil fuels. And we need to do all we can to protect it and ensure that that's able to move forward. But I just threw a lot at you in a really quick amount of time. So I can answer any questions if you have them. I always do end up doing presentations way faster than I intend to. So I hope it was simple enough to follow.
So we're a small enough group so you can just unmute if there's a pause in a conversation and speak up.
I have a question. If my Congress folks are in favor of the things that I would be asking for, is there anything else that I can do if they're already on board?
That's a great question. I think it never hurts to thank your members for standing up and supporting programs that you care about. I think that there's value in them knowing the allies that they have, especially in their community. And so I would definitely encourage you to reach out and thank them for either their support or encouraging them if because there isn't a budget bill at the moment, still encouraging them to support certain programs and oppose anything that would be harmful.
Thank you.
Would it help us to contact our senators, or their work is already done so we don't need to contact them?
That's a great question. I think so right now, even though the Senate did pass their 12 appropriations titles, they still have to go through the negotiation process with the House, and we don't quite know where they're going to have to meet somewhere in the middle, and we don't quite know what that's going to look like. And so because there isn't bill text yet, I don't see any harm in contacting your senators as well.
Any other questions?
Interested in finding a certain subset of vehicles.
Julia, that did not come through real clearly. Maybe you can state it again. All right, I'm going to ask Madison and everybody else who has crystal balls to get them out and polish them up. And we know that crystal balls are not accurate, but if we do have a government shutdown, are the people and insiders within the Beltway saying it's going to be a short government shutdown, or it could be an extended one like we had a couple of years ago?
That is a great question. And from the folks that I have the privilege of working with who are much more in the weeds on this, I think it's pretty clear that no one knows what's happening. There's not a clear plan. There's not any clear idea of where the House is headed. It seems pretty clear that McCarthy doesn't even have a plan. And so it's unfortunately just an incredibly cloudy crystal ball. There's no clear clarity whatsoever. And I mean that I'm hoping that over the next several days it will become more clear. But I think because of the way that the House Freedom Caucus has been operating, they've been just pretty adamant about certain things that has caused quite a wrench in any progress. And so I think it's kind of a wait and see period, and which is not where you want to be.
Wow, that's sad. Patricia?
I guess I have 3 questions. If there's a government shutdown, what happens to the SNAP food program, our Social Security payments, the farmer support that the government does, especially since we're going into fall harvest time? Any ideas?
That's a great question, and I should know the answer to it, but if I'm remembering correctly, and please fact check me on this, I believe there are certain programs that are still funded even in a government shutdown. Like there are like necessary programs that are, but I can't remember off the top of my head which ones they are. I think that there's always concern around SNAP and other programs that help a lot of folks in need. But I'd have to get back to you on the specifics.
A large part of the budget has already been set. This is really only the part that they can move around, correct?
Also good question. There are definitely different parts. This is the like wonky side of the budget that I feel like I'm still constantly learning about, because there is some like discretionary funding and non-discretionary funding, and part of it does get approved. Out I'm afraid I'm going to butcher this, so and again, please feel free to fact check me. But like I know there are bigger chunks of the pie that have go about different different processes, but I think it ends up all kind of going through the same channels.
So perhaps we could take Patricia's great questions, and those of you who love doing searches could do a search on the internet and on the web and find out the answer to her questions. She asked about SNAP, she asked about funding for farmers, and she asked about checks that go out to citizens of the United States, Social Security and disability. Am I correct, Patricia? Those were your 3 areas?
Social Security, yes.
So if anybody wants to volunteer to take a look at any of those and be and help us out, that would be a great way for all of us to learn. Okay, so Ellen has already said that SNAP stops paying in a government shutdown. So we got the answer to that one. Thank
It
you.
looks like Social Security is protected. I knew there was something.
Does that
Some of
mean,
us desperately need it.
Mhm.
And what about the farmers?
I would assume that would not be protected, unfortunately.
Ouch.
But I again that's an assumption. I need to fact check.
so Ellen says TANF is protected. Can you tell us what TANF is?
Temporary assistance for needy families.
Oh, okay. Thank you. So the poor farmers who are, we're trying to pass a farm bill and desperately need to change the way farmers do, and we want to change it so that it's more climate resilient, would not get the funding that they need at this time of the year. But Social Security would come in and protection for families, but they would not get the SNAP program. Okay, thanks, Madison. Here's a helpful resource on the government shutdown. And there's no impact on disability or Social Security. If somebody has two screens, perhaps we might want to take a look at the useful resource on government shutdowns. Madison, do you want to put it up? Or well, while you're trying to put it up, Patricia has another question.
Yes, I keep hearing from animal lovers associations about all of the government experiments that are going on, how they've just acquired, I don't know how many 100 puppies. They have so many kittens now, they're doing experiments on. Will that be stopped also? Or is that going to keep on going if the government shuts down? Any ideas?
Unfortunately have no clear idea what that would look like. I would assume if it's not absolutely necessary, then it would probably be shut down. But I'm not in that realm of research or science to give you a full answer.
Hopefully they keep feeding them and watering them and cleaning them up. Okay, thanks.
But EPA would shut down, NIH would shut down, all of the agencies of the government would shut down. The post office, I believe, because it's partially not privatized, continues. I remember that from the last time.
Yeah, and a lot of Hill staff aren't able to work. If I remember correctly, only absolutely essential employees in Congress are stay and work during government shutdown. So capacity to be able to engage with constituents is much lower, and it's just becomes a much harder situation to do any sort of contact or advocacy.
And that, to be clear, that would be October 1st, that it would start unless we get a continuing resolution.
Yes, exactly.
So Madison, can you share that document with us? Maybe we can go over a couple of points.
What the
You put in the one you put in the chat, the helpful resource on
Mhm.
government shutdowns. Thanks.
mhm. Do you want me to share my screen or
Yeah, please.
okay? So it says here, this shows all of the programs that are protected. So we have Social Security and Medicare, environmental and food inspections. Wait, I think I might be reading this wrong. I apologize.
Well, I think the key sentence, although many programs are exempt, the public is still likely to feel the impact of the shutdown. And then they give an example. So some of the examples make sense, like food inspection, national parks. I mean, there were thousands of people that returned in 2013, although the National Park Service itself was not really shut down. What we're saying is the limited staff, we can't do that. Air traffic was constrained. So, we're going to continue doing the minimum that we possibly can do, but we certainly won't be operating well, efficiently, or getting things done. It's an excellent resource that we all pay attention to. Thank you. Any other questions? Not a very.
Did she send that out to us by email? I'd like to be able to read the whole document. We went through it too fast.
Yeah, we always send those out.
Okay, thank you.
Sometimes it takes a little bit of time, but we send out two things. We send out the recording all the time, and then it's always available on the IPL Pennsylvania website, Pennsylvania IPL website. And quickly, a trick that I learned, if you want to get that resource tonight, because it's in the chat, you can simply copy and paste or open up the document yourself from the chat. And then once you've opened it up, you'll have it on your computer and you can save it on your computer. Any other questions about appropriations and the horrible situation that we're in because of such a divided country and government?
I have a question. Are there any Republicans in the House who are more moderate and who we could encourage our Democratic representatives to perhaps try to communicate with? My rep is Democratic and very pro-environment, and I'm sure did not vote with the Republicans. Are the Republicans totally opposed? I know their leadership is, but are there moderate Republicans who who we should encourage our Democratic reps to try to convince? Maybe, I don't think the Republican leadership will be swayed by any Democratic, but there may be some moderate Republicans who are willing to listen and dialogue.
That is a great question, and I think it's hard to answer because the state of the Republican Party is, as we all know, in a tough place. And obviously there are some who may fall a little bit more moderate. And we do have a appropriations toolkit that has some targets in it that some of our partners have identified as targets to really emphasize the messaging around protecting key programs that we care about, and obviously trying to prevent a shutdown. And I can share that. I'll put it in the chat, but I'm sure Phyllis and Renica can share it around also. But I can't think of any off the top of my head at the moment, but we do have some in there that I'd be happy to share.
That's a perfect segue for Renica to tell us what our action is and why we're asking everybody to talk about, to their congressperson, about passing a clean budget. Emphasis is on clean and no shutdowns. Continuing resolutions are better than shutdowns.
Yeah, absolutely. So myself and Katie Ruth, who's our PA IPL's executive director, we created an action alert that I will drop in the chat really quick.
I'm just looking at an article in USA Today that says there is a bipartisan problem solvers caucus, which is made up of centrist Republicans and Democratic lawmakers in the House. I think that might be valuable to look that group up and see who are members of that.
What's the name of it?
It's called the Bipartisan Problem Solvers Caucus.
Yep, they've done a lot of really good things in the past.
Yeah, I see Representative Brian Fitzpatrick is one of the co-chairs.
Is anybody in Brian Fitzpatrick's district? Well, if you know anybody who is, I believe he's Bucks County, correct, Virginia?
Yeah, Don Bacon from Nebraska. He's a Republican. So I'm trying to see when this article was published. Oh, this is today's article in USA Today. So maybe look up the article.
I would suspect that those are the Republicans that are willing to make a consensus and not just stand with their head in the sand and say, no, I'm not going to agree with anything. Great, thank you, Virginia. Okay, back to Renica.
Yeah, I also wanted to say thanks, Madison. I didn't mention this earlier, for your wonderful presentation, because there's always something new to learn for me about federal policy. And so I'm really thankful that you're here sharing your time with us. Like I said, I just dropped an action alert in the chat that I created with our executive director, Katie Ruth, who's the executive director of PA IPL. And this document's short. It gives a very, very brief overview of the appropriations process, which Madison expanded on, as well as a really short script that you can use to contact your representatives or your senators. There's also a link in there that you can use to find them if you're not sure who they are or how to contact them. This link is also going to be sent in a follow-up email for everybody. And the reason we're providing this, it's an option that's similar to the model we used for comment collection earlier in the year. So you might remember that that was a Google form. And you could submit a pre-written comment through that form. And then within the form, there was also an option to add your own thoughts. So we're offering a similar opportunity here, where I'm going to drop a Google form in the chat as well. Really quick. And this is also going to be in a follow-up email. But again, the reason we're doing this is because in this form, you can write your name and your zip code, and PA IPL can deliver a message to Senators Fetterman and Senator Casey for you if you'd like. There's also a space to write your own additional thoughts in the Google form, and either one of these methods is a great option for contacting your representatives. The Google form is optional. It's only there to make it an easier lift, similar to the comment collection model. So you'll essentially sign your name to a message that PA IPL will deliver for you, rather than you contacting their offices directly. So please just do whatever you feel that you have the capacity to do. In the longer document that contains the action alert, Madison mentioned it's always great to thank your senators, even if you know that they're already on board. So this script, you can also modify it if you're going to contact somebody directly to be more of a thank you. And that's what I've got for you tonight. I hope you find it helpful. And yeah, thank you all for being here.
So it's really important to contact your representative if your representative is not on board. Sometimes just a few people in their district can make a difference because they're hearing from paid lobbyists on a very regular basis. If they really to hear from their constituents. And it's also senators and Congress people really like to be thanked. They want to know that their constituents are supporting them in what they're doing. So I believe that Casey and Fetterman are totally on board with this since the Senate has passed it. And there's not a huge margin in the Senate, so I'm assuming both of them have passed it. But we may have representatives that are not as much on board. And Renica and I would be very happy to help people who've never made a comment before, written a letter before. So if you have a question, you can send it to us, email it to us, and we would be real happy to help you out. It doesn't have to be Shakespeare. It doesn't have to be extremely well written. All it has to say is, this is what we want you to do. And the script in the toolkit is very helpful. I'll put my email in the chat also. Although I suspect if you write to IPL, it would get to us. We're a small enough organization. So I want to thank Madison for being the person inside the Beltway and letting us see what's going on when all we hear from the news is the horrible stuff, and letting us see what the issues are. I want to thank Renica for really picking up, and Katie for picking up the workload on developing a toolkit and an action item. We may be ahead of the game in terms of other IPLs, and I suspect Madison might be sharing your action toolkit with other places. And we do want to encourage people to fill out the Google form and use the toolkit. Do contact your people. The more you get in the habit of contacting, the easier it becomes. And thank you so much for your questions, and thank you for participating and sharing really good information, checking things on the web and giving us information. So a very successful information sharing meeting, and thank you for coming. I'm also happy to hear any topics that you want to be talking about. In October, I think we're going to talk about the need to vote and all the candidates. In November, I believe we're going to be talking about how do you write a letter to the editor, what topics do you talk about. But those are all tentative, and we can change because there may be something more pressing. So thank you so much and have a good evening.